Let's be friends.
Have you not?
Greetings, everyone, and hello. It's the Ambassador, and welcome back to the Ambassadorial Wing. And, well, it has been a while since I have done a review of a horror movie. As a matter of fact, I think I've very sparingly ever done a review of a horror movie for my channel, to be honest with you all. But I've been hearing comments and discussions on a particular movie that came out last year in 2024 by a director that I know very little about, one Mr. Robert Eggers. And the film, of course, that we're going to be discussing is Nosferatu, 2024. Not to be confused with the original black and white soundless Nosferatu that came out in the I believe it was the late 1920s or early 1930s. But what we have here, and I have, just for the record, I have seen the original Nosferatu in its entirety, and even that film made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up on end just a little bit. And for those of you that probably know, I am a fan of vampire movies. I mean, I grew up watching Bela Lugosi's Dracula and some of the Christopher Lee vampire films, of course. You've got Interview with the Vampire, you've got Blade, you've got the Twilight films, and so on. You've got one of my all-time favorite TV shows right here, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You can sort of see it. So yeah, I have always been a fan of vampires and vampire films and so on. And what we have here is a return to form of the classic vampire character, in a manner of speaking, although in a more grotesque form. And I have to admit, the cast for this film, I knew some of the cast, for instance, Nicholas Hoult, which I just discussed and everything just recently in my review of Superman 2025. Of course, William Dafoe, I mean, goes without saying, one of the great actors of many generations. But there was a couple of actors that I was not familiar with. Of course, one being Lily Rose Depp, the daughter of course, Johnny Depp, and Bill Skarsgård, who plays the villainous and rather creepy and disgusting and disturbing looking Count Orlok in this particular version of Nosferatu. And if I were to use a few words to describe this movie, unsettling, gothic, atmospheric, terrifying would be a few of those words to describe it. Because I've always considered myself a fan of horror movies. As I mentioned, I grew up watching the old Universal monster movies. I grew up in the 80s and 90s with all the great slashers of that time. So horror movies are not anything new to me, and I grew up with some of the really good stuff, at least in my opinion. But what we have here with Robert Eggers' version of Nosferatu is not only a return to form for the character of the vampire. This isn't the vampire that's all glittery, and no, that's not a dig, because I do like the Twilight films. But this isn't the hero, the vampire that's the hero, like with Blade or so on. And this isn't the vampire that is the tragic figure as he is portrayed in other vampire films. This is definitely not Lestat or Louis from Interview with the Vampire. And this is definitely not Blade from, the Blade films, portrayed by Wesley Snipes. This is the vampire as he was always intended to be. The menace upon humanity. The darkest shadow in the corner of our dreams. And what Robert Eggers brought to this film, including the actors that participated in it, was nothing short of stellar. I don't gush generally when it comes to my movie reviews, but this is the first horror movie that I've seen in a while that gave me legitimate creeps. And for those of you who know me and know my disposition or know my taste in movies, it takes a lot to give me the creeps. But this film was unsettling, but in all the best ways. And I have to admit, this is my first performance. This is the first time seeing a performance by Lily Rose Depp. But I have to admit, her portrayal as Lady Herter, as I will refer to her in this review, because I honestly cannot remember her first name. It's not that her name isn't memorable, but I honestly can't recall it. But she is, in a lot of ways, the driving force in this film because she is directly linked to Count Orlok. And I have to admit that Scars, I know Stellan Skarsgård. I mean, the guy is one of my all-time favorite actors, but I believe the actor's name is Bill Skarsgård, who plays Count Orlok in this. At least I remember his last name being Skarsgård. So, if I'm incorrect in his first name, I do apologize. So, I'm a little rusty at this, y'all. So please forgive me. But what we have here is a extremely gothic story in all of the best ways. It really harkens back to those old gothic stories that were written by Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe, and of course Bram Stoker, whose book Dracula was a inspiration for this, for both the original film and for this remake. Although I would not even necessarily call this a remake per se, because the style and the tone are so utterly different that this is its own film in a lot of ways, though it does bear the same name as the original silent film, obviously. But what Robert Eggers and the crew that worked with him sought to do was bring a old world tale into the modern time. And they do this in many impressive ways. Of course, the performances by the cast is the main thing, but the set design, the fact that they scoured architectural archives and picture archives of old world Germany and of the 1800s and beforehand and so on, and that they spent so much time building the sets for the town that the majority of the story takes place in, of course, that being Visburg and Count Orlok's castle and the Transylvanian village that Thomas Herter travels to on his way to Count Orlok's castle. And the design for all of this was so intricately well designed, and it looks and it feels like the real world, even though you know it, that world, even though you know it isn't. And the design for Count Orlok himself, as I mentioned, this is a harkening back to the classic design of the vampire, and it does draw some inspiration from the original Nosferatu film. But this version of Count Orlok, his design is in a lot of ways disturbing, and it's meant to be. And this is a blight upon humanity. This is an otherworldly threat that seeks to devour life and destroy anything in its path that will not bend to its will. This is, as Orlok describes himself, I am a hunger. I am an appetite, nothing more. and he seeks to dominate and to destroy and to prolong his own existence at the sake of the rest of humanity. But what we have also is a tie between Orlok and Lady Herter. And what we discover in this film is that she is what we would call, or what would be called at the time, a clairvoyant or a seer. She has the gift of foresight and everything. She can see the future. And she's also connected to the netherworld in a way, because she can communicate with with Count Orlok through her visions. And one thing that William Defoe's character, Professor von Franz, says to her towards the climax of the film, I think during the third act, in heathen times you might have been a priestess of Isis, but now you are simply our redemption. And one of the other themes that plays out in this film is how the progress of society has caused us as a civilization to discredit the supernatural and the occult. And when faced with this idea that this otherworldly being that specifically is Count Orlok has come to Visburg and is the source of the plague that is consuming the city and the people in it, the scientific minds of the time and the more civilized people of that area simply cannot accept it. And that's also something that is echoed by Count Orlok himself, because he says to Thomas Herder there at his castle, I look forward to moving to your Visburg and to the city of more modern minds that do not believe in such superstition. Because it is people of superstition that understand just how dangerous Orlok really is. And what we have in this film is a clash between the old world and old world superstitions and the new world and modern thinking, minds of science and of progress. And science and progress are by no means bad things, but we should not allow our progress as a civilization to stymie our belief that there is something beyond what we can prove through scientific process and through reason and through logic, because there are some things that are most definitely beyond any of those things. And it is because of Professor von Franz and because of Lady Herter that Count Orlok is ultimately destroyed. And yes, mild spoilers in this film for those of you that may have not seen it. But even though I have spoiled this, I hope that my discussion of this film will, if you have not seen this film already, I would encourage you, go get a copy of it, or if it is on streaming somewhere that you can view it, do so. Because honestly, this is a film that takes you on a journey into a world that we have kind of forgotten about. And one of the other things I deeply appreciate is that this was, in fact, a passion project of Robert Eggers himself. He had seen the original Nosferatu when he was growing up, and when he was in film school, he had actually done a small production of it for part of his university work, and it had stuck with him for so long. And like I said, I am relatively new to the work of Robert Eggers. I know he's done some other films. He had done The Northman, he had done The Witch, and so on. But this was my first experience watching one of his films, and I will say if this is any indication of the level of his work, then I probably need to give some of his other films um, a look, most definitely. But I have to also say that the performance by William Dafoe as Professor von Franz, who is a stand-in for the classic character that we know from Bram Stoker's Dracula of Professor Abraham Van Helsing, who we know from, of course, the original Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, and of course the 1930s Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Professor Van Helsing was a character in that film, and of course there was the early 2000s film with Hugh Jackman, who played the titular uh, Van Helsing, who was a monster hunter at the time. And of course, there was Anthony Hopkins, who portrayed Professor Van Helsing and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula in the 1990s as well. But what William Dafoe brings to this character, and how they crafted the background behind Professor von Franz. This is a professor, a man of learning, a man of distinction, and who was very distinguished, who was very respected in the academic field. But he had started studying and researching the occult, and believed in things beyond what the science of the time could prove. And it got him unceremoniously tossed out of his position. But in encountering Orlok and encountering Lady Herter and her otherworldly abilities, a lot of his theories and so on were actually proven correct. So this is, I think, in a lot of ways, not just a redemption story for Lady Herter, played by Lily Rose Depp, but also for Professor von Franz, because he now has undisputable proof that the supernatural does in fact exist, because he has now combated it head on. And of course, he has the book and everything that he confiscates from Herr Knox, one of Count Orlok's affiliates' office there in Visburg. But if I were going to give this movie a score, I would have to score this very highly, because that's just how impressed with it I am. Not just because it is a horror movie or a vampire film, and not just because I'm a fan of those types of films, but because of the work and the effort that was put into this film by Robert Eggers. So I rarely give this score. For those of you that know how I score my films and everything that I discuss and I review for the channel, but I have to give this film a 10 out of 10. It is just simply that good. And as I said before, if you have not checked out Nosferatu, I encourage you to do so. It will take you on a journey that will both horrify you, but also mystify you, and at times may unnerve you, particularly with Lily Rose Depp's performance. And I will just say this in brief before I close out. Lily Rose Depp's performance in this film is nothing short of staggering. She really goes to a place with her performance as Lady Herter that, well, you have to see it for yourself if you haven't already. But with that being said, folks, I hope you enjoyed this review. Of course, check out my other ones here on the channel, and of course, I'll be posting new ones here in the next few days and weeks. So be sure to keep an eye out on my social media for those as well, particularly on X and on Instagram. But with all that being said, folks, you have a good one, and until next time, this is the Ambassador, signing off.